This week on the Communicators, Representative Rick Boucher discusses the agenda of the House subcommittee that oversees telecommunications and technology policy. Mr. Boucher became its chairman at the start of the 111th Congress.
This week, the Communicators airs from the office of Representative Rick Boucher of Virginia. He is the chairman of the Communications, Technology, and the Internet Subcommittee. Mr. Congressman, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
And David Hatch also joins us. He works for Congress Daily, covers technology and telecommunications issues for that publication. Thanks to you, sir.
Thank you.
Can we start generally? There was a name change for this subcommittee. Why the name change, and I guess, does it reflect a new philosophy when it comes to the committee?
I don't think the name change really reflects anything other than the preference of a new chairman of the full committee to have some different nomenclature for the subcommittees that perhaps are more consistent with his view of modern day jurisdictions and the kinds of work that the subcommittees will do. It used to be the Subcommittee on Telecommunications. Now it's the Subcommittee on Communications, Technology, and the Internet. Obviously, the Internet has become a far more common way that people use to communicate. and I think the name change perhaps reflects that emergence of the Internet as a medium that is used for multimedia communications.
So as chairman of this subcommittee, because you came from another subcommittee, or if I recall, what do you hope to bring to it personally? I guess, what are your interests as head of it, and what are the things that you'd like to get done with this subcommittee?
Well, there are a number of immediate goals, and I think most importantly for the nation, for revival of our economy, and also for the long-term economic success of the entire country is deploying broadband much more comprehensively. And I suppose if I have an overriding goal as chair of this subcommittee, it will be to encourage a greater degree of broadband deployment. The good news on that front is that the stimulus measure, which the Congress is in the process of approving now, will provide about $6.5 billion for broadband deployment. The problems we have in terms of the absence of broadband largely are rural. We stand 16th in the world today in terms of broadband deployment as compared with other developed countries. And for the sake of our national economy, we need to be doing far better, and we can do far better. And I think the funds that are going to be provided will be surgically targeted toward the areas where the need is the greatest. And by deploying in rural areas, which we know we can do, we have programs established to do that, we can elevate our standing in the world, connect all of America with this 21st century essential technology, and make sure that we have a foundation for long-term economic success. And so if I have an overriding principle as the new chair of this committee, it will be to bring that very crisp focus to our work.
David Hatch.
Congressman, can you talk about your other priorities as chairman of the subcommittee, and what subjects do you plan on holding hearings?
Our first hearing will be on the reauthorization of the Home Satellite Viewer Act. That legislation, first enacted in the late 1980s, expires at the end of this year, and we have a need to process legislation rather promptly in order to make sure that that statute is modernized prior to the expiration date. This is the law that allows people who cannot get a network signal delivered over the air to an antenna from their local television station to subscribe to a satellite service that will import a distant network signal from some other market so that they have the benefit of network programs. There was a huge need for this across many stretches of rural America in the late 1980s, and this law has very appropriately filled that gap. But every 5 years we modernize it, we update it based upon current conditions. And the current condition that I would like to see us address now is the fact that since that law was adopted, we've had a new iteration of satellite delivered service. And that is local television stations uplinked to the satellite and then beamed back into the market in which those signals originate. We call that local-into-local service so that people watching the satellite can see their local TV stations. But that service is not available in all of the TV markets across the country. It's not available in approximately 30 out of 210 markets. And the markets where it is not available tend to be the smallest and the most rural. I actually represent one of those markets that's in my congressional district. My colleague in Virginia, a neighbor, Bob Goodlatte, represents another of those markets, also a Virginia market. And there are others spread around the nation in largely rural areas. And I would like to see, as a part of this reauthorization, steps be taken to make sure that the entire nation has the benefit of that very useful local-into-local service, including these 30 places across the country where we don't have it now. We have an urgent need, I think, to work with the Federal Communications Commission in order to write rules and facilitate an early auction for what's known as the D block. The D block is one of the slices of spectrum in the 700 megahertz spectrum that is being vacated by the nation's broadcasters as they turn off their analog transmitters and we transition to fully digital over-the-air television broadcasting. Other parts of that spectrum were auctioned successfully last year and derived for the government approximately $20 billion in revenue. The D block, however, was placed up for auction, and the auction did not receive sufficient bids, and so it was taken off the market. Now, the reason it didn't receive sufficient bids is because the bidding rules for the D block were different than for other parts of the spectrum. There was a goal to try to make sure that there was adequate funding in order to enable the public safety community nationwide, fire, police, rescue, to be able to deploy modern, fully interoperable technology so that fire could communicate with police, could communicate with rescue, and departments from all across the country could communicate one with the other where they converged on a common disaster of some sort in order to provide first responder assistance. We found in 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina that we still don't have that capability, and it's critically important in order to promote an appropriate response in those instances. And so we have spectrum available for first responders. We simply don't have funds in their hands sufficient to enable them to deploy the communications technology. The goal of the D block rules was to auction it to a bidder who would be a commercial provider and would use the spectrum himself. That commercial provider would deploy his own technology, but then he would have to share that technology, share that spectrum space with the first responder community. And there, frankly, was not a commercial bidder interested enough in that kind of arrangement to bid a sufficient sum in order for the spectrum to be sold. And so the result is now it is fallow, and we need to come back and write different rules and make sure that we put that commercial spectrum into service and at the same time derive revenue for the government. So the challenge that's unmet, let me just add, is we still don't have a concrete plan for helping the first responder community obtain the revenue it needs in order to deploy communications technology. So we will have to meet both of these goals and find a way to do it, and we look forward to working with the Commission in order to do that.
So simplification of the rules, I guess, from previous?
Well, I don't have a formula at the moment, but I can say that it is an agenda item for our subcommittee. It is something we look forward to working with the new chairman and members of the Federal Communications Commission in order to address, and hopefully we can do that within the months to come. One of our major goals in the subcommittee is going to be overseeing the digital television transition. We have new deadlines for that now, adopted by the Congress last week. The Federal Communications Commission, acting chairman, and I have been in communication about how we will together manage this process and help to oversee that transition and make sure that it's smooth and seamless, and we're confident that it will be with the new transition date. And we're also going to oversee the federal agencies, National Telecommunications and Information Administration within the Department of Commerce and the Rural Development Agency within the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as they deploy the grants from the stimulus fund in order to deploy broadband. And we'll be working with them on setting standards for that grant-making process. And it's my hope that we'll see some commonality between these two agencies in the standards for grant-making. I think that's to the benefit of applicants. I think it's to the benefit of communities. I think the standards will be better understood, if there is a substantial common ground between the way these two agencies are addressing these grants, inevitably there will have to be some differences because the Rural Development Agency will be focusing mostly on rural areas. NTIA will have purview of the entire nation, including urban areas, but there still can be commonality, should be. We look forward to working with the House Agriculture Committee that has authority over rural development as we have authority over NTIA. I have a longer agenda, but rather than take the entire hour describing it, maybe I should respond to your questions.
In regards to DTV then, can I ask about the nature of the discussions that you've had with the acting chairman, Michael Copps, and Anna Gomez, who now heads the NTIA, about what the plan is from now to June 12th?
We have been talking about a variety of things. It's important to understand that the new stimulus legislation, which as we have this conversation is making its way to final passage, provides $650 million for the DTV transition. That was necessary because the program as originally structured was underfunded. Many of us understood that pretty clearly from the outset and were warning that it was underfunded. Those warnings fell on deaf ears, unfortunately. But the Department of Commerce ran out of money last year in December in order to fund the coupon program for converter boxes. Consequently, we've got 6.5 million homes across the nation that are totally unprepared. Those are Nielsen's figures. And we have now more than 4 million applications for converter box coupons pending at NTIA with no money with which to honor those applications. So we have 650 million, and that's why we had to have the extension of the transition date. We now have $650 million coming into the pipeline that will enable the Department of Commerce to honor those coupon applications. And that money also can be used to help the Federal Communications Commission staff its call centers. And having those call centers be functional is absolutely essential to a smooth transition. Across a lot of America, we will have a complete absence of technical assistance for people to diagnose any kind of reception problems they're having. The call centers will be their principal point of contact. And I've been discussing with the acting chairman of the FCC how we can work together in order to coordinate the activity of the expenditure of those funds, oversee that, and continually get reports from the Department of Commerce from this time through June to make sure that the program is in fact functioning smoothly. We anticipate that it will. We think that that backlog is going to be cleared out rather promptly within a matter of a couple of months, and then we really don't foresee additional problems.
Congressman, the Federal Communications Commission has said that up to 700 TV stations may be cutting their analog signals on Tuesday anyway, despite the legislation that was just signed by the President, I think last night, that postpones the digital transition until June. Are you worried that Americans may not be prepared for these signals to go dark all across the country?
The number that I heard was more on the order of 400 stations. But yes, I do have some concerns. I actually, on Friday of last week, had a telephone conversation with the general managers of, all of the television stations that broadcast signals into my congressional district. That's about a dozen stations altogether, serving a variety of markets. And all of them, save one, have decided that they're going to keep their signal on the air until June the 12th. One of the stations plans to transition on February the 17th. My district is very rural. It is mountainous. The population tends to be more elderly than the average across the nation. Many of my constituents are low income, and I think these are the kinds of demographics about which we're concerned. Areas that meet that kind of description are likely to have the most problems with this transition. So I'm quite pleased by the response I've gotten from the TV stations in my region. I would hope that we'll see television stations serving mountainous, rural, typically elderly areas deciding to stay on the air because these are the parts of the country that I think are the least prepared. Across the nation, about 5.7% of the national television viewing audience is not prepared. These are Nielsen's numbers. I think they're the most reliable surveys we've seen. And if 1 out of every 20 homes loses television service when the transition occurs, I think most people would say the transition has been a failure. We can't tolerate that level of disconnection, and that's why we moved the transition date. A television station that serves an urban area that's flat, where local surveys suggest that most people are prepared, could make this transition at an earlier time. And so we provided in the law a lot of flexibility. And if a TV station believes its market is transition ready, and there's not going to be dislocation because of the analog signal being turned off, I see no problem with such a television station deciding to transition early. But in other parts of the country where that situation does not pertain and people are really not ready, the signal needs to stay on. And I think largely television stations understand that and are going to make the right decision. We're going to have some problems on February 17th. We're going to be watching those closely. We may have a hearing at some point that addresses what concerns have arisen in order to highlight areas in which perhaps TV stations that might be planning an early transition sometime after February 17 but before June 12 can learn from that example and perhaps alter their plans and stay on the air through the June 12 date.
If I could just follow up, you mentioned about the waiting list for the converter box coupons, the government-issued coupons. There are hardworking Americans who are waiting months for these coupons. Is there anything else that you can do to try to expedite the process so they can get these vouchers more quickly and be able to prepare for the new deadline?
Well, the key thing that can and is being done is provide funding for the Department of Commerce. The reason these individuals have not gotten their coupons as of today is because the program ran out of money. And it was pretty clear to most of us that it was going to run out of money. The administration that preceded this one refused to request any additional funds or accept any additional funds for the program, and that was a mistake. Looking backward doesn't help us at this point, but it suggests that the problem was an absence of resources. Now we're providing the resources with $650 million, part of which will go to the coupon program. I think an adequate amount will go to that program, and the balance of it goes to public education and outreach, and that portion will help to fund the FCC's call centers that will be critical points of contact for people who install a converter box but still have some kind of reception problem, probably suggesting that they have to make an antenna adjustment. So I'm confident we have the mechanisms now in place for a smooth transition. We're going to be watching it very carefully. This will be a coordinated effort between our subcommittee and the Federal Communications Commission. But I think we have every reason now to expect that over the coming months, the backlog of coupon requests will be cleared out. People will get their coupons in the mail. My advice to television viewers is don't hesitate. If you haven't applied for a coupon and you need one, go ahead and apply. Every household's entitled to get 2. Once they arrive, don't hesitate. Get a converter box quickly, install it, test it, scan for the channels, make sure you're getting the digital signal. If you're not, you'll have time to determine what additional problem you might have, perhaps the need to replace an antenna or relocate the one that's presently in service. It's important to do all of that well before June the 12th, and I think if people follow that advice and if they get their coupons early and install their converter boxes, we're going to have a smooth transition.
In terms of what you talked about earlier concerning broadband in more rural areas, have you heard from technology, or not so much technology companies, but those who provide internet and broadband about provisions in the $6 billion or so that would include net neutrality language or open access language? Do you hear from those in the business about and their concerns over it? And what are they saying?
There have been questions asked about what that language means, and the language is very broad. As it appears in the final legislation, it basically says 2 things. First of all, that those who are recipients of the grants will have to honor interconnection rights. That is traditional in telecommunications law today, so I don't see that as being anything very different or perhaps even at all different than what everyone is used to. It also says that non-discriminatory treatment must be assured. Now, that's an undefined term in the statute. And it will be the role of the grant-making agencies to determine what non-discrimination means. And we look forward to working with those agencies to make sure that as that definition is given substance, that it does not impose obligations on the broadband providers that would lead them not to apply for these grants. We want them to be a part of this process. We want them to be actively involved in seeking grants and putting forward their good plans for how this money can be expended to deploy broadband. And we don't want these requirements to stand in the way of their willingness to do that. So that's a balance that we have to strike, and I think we can. Let me comment on the general subject of network neutrality, because this subject inevitably arises in telecommunications conversations. We had a debate 3 years ago that was generated from announcements that had been made by several of the larger broadband providers that they intended to alter their business model and start charging internet content providers like Google and Yahoo and others for access to their customers if the access was going to be accelerated and provided at the highest speeds. And so in essence, the broadband providers had proposed what amounts to a two-lane last mile, a two-lane internet from the local central office into the premises of users. Now that would have been a dramatic change in the architecture of the internet, and it raised enormous concern on the part of millions of people around the country. Congress responded with hearings and with an effort to pass legislation, in essence prohibiting the establishment of a two-lane last mile, a fast lane for accelerated content for those who paid for entry, and a slow lane to which everyone else would be relegated. And I oppose that kind of architecture change as well. But rather than engage in this classic debate, shall we permit that or prohibit that, I think we need to be more forward-looking. And starting about a year ago, I actually encouraged the broadband providers to sit down with the content originators and see if there was not some possible common ground. I think with conversation and more clarity being brought to what the core concerns of each side would be, there is an opportunity to achieve a more general understanding of what is an effective network management practice, and everyone concedes the broadband providers need to be able to engage in that, and what kind of assurances can be given to the edge providers, to the content originators, that they can reach their customers in an appropriate way. Those conversations are beginning to take place. I intend to be involved in them, and hopefully we can achieve some form of agreement that can avoid the necessity of having to re-engage in the old debate about network neutrality. I think a new kind of parameter for that debate is appropriate, and hopefully we can have some agreements achieved among the core parties with regard to what kind of regime for that should be put in place.
Congressman, are you confident that the broadband provisions in the stimulus package will help rural Americans who need them most, people that completely lack access to high-speed internet?
The answer is yes. In my congressional district, which I'll use as an example, a very rural place, 27 counties and cities in the mountainous western part of the state of Virginia, we have had great success in accessing the limited government funds that have been traditionally available in order to deploy broadband. We have focused on it in my office. We have made determining the eligibility of our communities and working with them and preparing grant applications to that program a priority. And as a result of that effort, last year we received 5 grants from the U.S. Department of Agriculture's program in order to deploy broadband in communities that had no broadband at all. And most of these grants were in the neighborhood of about $200,000 to $500,000. And for that level of expenditure, we have been able to deploy broadband to communities of approximately 100 to 150 homes, businesses, schools, churches that lacked broadband completely. Typically, these were very small communities, often ringed by mountains, a long way from the nearest large town. And we have been able to use those funds efficiently in order to deploy broadband. So I personally have no doubt that with the provision of substantial new resources and with the programs in place that are already doing a good job with very limited funding of expanding high-speed internet access to places where it is absent today, that we can do much more to fill the gap and elevate our standing in the world from 16th in broadband deployment to a far higher number. The stimulus money can achieve that goal for us, and not only does it help create jobs in the short term with the deployment and with some of the businesses that can locate in these communities once broadband is provided, but it builds a solid foundation for long-term economic growth and the success of the national economy. So this is one of the wisest investments that I think we're going to be making through the stimulus package.
Congressman, we have about a couple minutes left. I wanted to ask you, over the years, there have been concerns from Capitol Hill and others about privacy issues, especially those amongst those who use search engines. Is that a concern for you? And is this something, do you envision that your committee or subcommittee might tackle?
I think it's both a concern, but it also reflects an opportunity. I personally believe that electronic commerce can be expanded dramatically if the American consumers of products and services using the internet as a delivery platform can be assured of a higher level of privacy with respect to their personal information. In fact, I intend to put forward, along with the ranking Republican member of the subcommittee, Congressman Cliff Stearns from Florida, legislation that will assure that higher level of privacy protection. We will be working with one of the other subcommittees on our Commerce Committee that also has jurisdiction over this subject as we develop that measure. And the goal of the measure will make sure that people have an opportunity to know what information about them is collected by the websites they visit, how that information is used by the website for its own marketing or perhaps for sale to others, and then have an opportunity to act on that knowledge by declining to allow the information to be collected, or once it is collected, declining the ability of the website to send that information, for example, to third parties. And if we can put those kinds of requirements in the law, I think the result is going to be far more confidence on the part of internet users and a much greater willingness to engage in electronic commerce. So this will help the growth and development of the internet. It will help the people who depend on the internet today to sell products and services, and it will offer a real protection that is much needed for internet users.
We have about 30 seconds, but in the growth of electronic commerce, especially among search engines and stuff, as they expand more services, for example, Google has a book program, they want to monitor certain things. Do those things eventually pose issues of antitrust or maybe that competition with other types of services? And is that a concern for you as well, as far as monitoring how big a search engine might get as far as the services they provide?
Well, as long as search is search, I don't think there are competitive issues with that. When any company aggregates its services and begins to dominate markets, and because of the size of that company relevant to the market, it begins to have anti-competitive effects. We have well-honed mechanisms for addressing that through the Department of Justice and its antitrust agency and through the Federal Trade Commission. And I have confidence in those mechanisms. I also serve on the House Judiciary Committee where we have that authority and we oversee that activity very closely.
Representative Rick Boucher represents Virginia. He is the chairman of the Communications, Technology, and Internet Subcommittee. Joining us in the questioning today was David Hatch of Congress Daily. To both of you, thanks for being on the Communicators.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Nice to be with you.